I became a duchess the moment the priest spoke the truth, and I lost everything the moment my husband heard it. The words still echo in my mind like the toll of a funeral bell, each syllable a nail in the coffin of the life I might have lived. I had not wanted this. I need you to understand that before anything else. I had not schemed or dreamed or hoped for the title that now sits heavy on my shoulders like a winter cloak lined with stones. I was the shadow sister, the one who read while Vivian danced, the one who listened while she laughed, the one who loved quietly while she collected hearts like pressed flowers in a book. We were twins, yes, identical in every way that eyes could see, but in all the ways that mattered, we were as different as moonlight and flame. It was Vivian who was promised to the Duke of Ashford. Vivian with her golden laugh and her way of tilting her head just so when a gentleman spoke, making him feel as though he were the only man in the world. Our father had arranged it, of course, during one of those smoky evenings in his study when men decide the fates of daughters over brandy and cigars. The Duke needed a wife of proper lineage and sufficient beauty to grace his ancestral home. Vivienne needed a title to match her ambitions. It seemed, to everyone, a perfect arrangement. I remember the day Father told us. We were in the morning room, the September light falling through the tall windows in golden sheets that made the dust motes dance like tiny stars. Vivienne had clapped her hands together and laughed that bright, crystalline laugh of hers. I had smiled and said all the right things because that was what I did. I was the good daughter, the obedient one, the one who never caused trouble or raised her voice or wanted anything that was not already offered. The courtship, if one could call it that, was brief and formal. The Duke came to call exactly 4 times before the engagement was announced. I watched from the shadows of doorways, from the safety of my books and my quiet corners, as he sat stiffly in our drawing room and made polite conversation with a woman he barely knew. He was handsome in that austere marble statue way that powerful men often are. Dark hair, darker eyes, a jawline that could cut glass, and a mouth that seemed to have forgotten how to smile. He spoke of his estates, his duties, his expectations. Vivian nodded and fluttered her fan, and said yes, and of course, and whatever you wish, my lord. But I saw something in those visits that perhaps no one else noticed. I saw the way his fingers tightened on his teacup when Vivian interrupted him. I saw the brief flash of something like disappointment when she giggled at his serious remarks. I saw him glance toward the window as though already counting the minutes until he could leave. And once, just once, his eyes found mine across the room where I sat in my usual chair with my embroidery, and something passed between us, some flicker of recognition or understanding that was gone before I could name it. The letters began after his 3rd visit. Love letters, Vivian called them, though I heard more duty than devotion in the carefully chosen words. She would bring them to me, waving the heavy cream paper like a flag of victory, demanding that I read them aloud because she found his penmanship difficult and his language dull. So I read them, every one, and I began to see a different man in those lines. A man who wrote of the changing seasons on his northern estates, of the way the moors looked in morning mist, of the weight of legacy and the loneliness of duty. A man who asked questions and seemed genuinely curious about the answers. A man who, I began to suspect, was looking for a companion of the mind as much as an ornament for his arm. Vivian laughed at his questions and tossed the letters aside. So I answered them for her. It started innocently enough, helping her compose replies because she had no patience for the task. But slowly, imperceptibly, those replies became mine. I wrote of books I had read, of thoughts I had entertained, of the small beauties I noticed in ordinary days. I wrote as Vivian, in her name, with her signature, but the words were mine. The heart behind them was mine. And I told myself it did not matter because he would never know the difference. He wrote back with increasing frequency, and I watched my sister grow bored with the very correspondence that made my pulse quicken each time the post arrived. She began to make excuses, to send me to retrieve the letters from the hall table, to ask me to pen the responses while she prepared for balls and assemblies where younger, more entertaining men waited. And I, God forgive me, was glad of it. Those letters became the brightest hours of my days, the secret garden where I could be myself, where someone listened and responded and seemed to value the thoughts I had never been encouraged to voice aloud. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in November, when the leaves would be gold and red and the air would carry the first whisper of winter. The preparations consumed our household like a fever. Seamstresses came and went, flowers were debated, guest lists were revised and expanded. Vivian glowed with triumph, already imagining herself as a duchess, already planning the renovations she would make to Ashford Hall, already composing the letters she would write to her friends, signed with her new, glorious title. I helped her with everything, as I always had. I held her hand while she was fitted for her wedding gown, a magnificent creation of ivory silk and Brussels lace that had taken 3 women 6 weeks to complete. I listened to her nervous chatter about the wedding night, about whether the Duke would be pleased with her, about what it would be like to be mistress of such a grand estate. I smiled and soothed and reassured, and at night I lay awake in my bed and tried not to imagine what it would be like when she left and I was alone again, returned to my proper place in the shadows. The night before the wedding, she came to my room. It was late, well past midnight, and I was not yet asleep. I rarely slept well anymore, haunted by thoughts I could not quite name and a restlessness that had no outlet. She slipped through my door like a ghost in her white nightgown, her face pale in the moonlight that streamed through my window. "Eleanor," she whispered, and there was something in her voice that made my heart stop. "I cannot do this." I sat up in bed, reaching for the candle on my bedside table, but she caught my hand. Her fingers were ice cold and trembling. "I cannot marry him," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "I do not love him. I will never love him. He is cold and serious, and he looks at me as though I am a disappointing painting he has purchased unseen. I have tried, Eleanor, truly I have tried to imagine a life with him, but I cannot breathe when I think of it. It is like a coffin closing over me, like being buried alive in silk and propriety." I stared at her, my mind racing, but finding no solid ground. "You are nervous," I said finally, trying to sound calm and reasonable. "It is natural before such a great change. But he is a good man, Vivian. He is honorable and wealthy, and he will take care of you. You will grow to love him in time." She shook her head violently, her loose hair flying around her shoulders like dark water. No, I will not. I know myself, Eleanor. I know what I need and what I can bear. And I cannot bear this. I do not want to be a duchess. I do not want to live in that cold northern house and wear heavy jewels and host tedious dinners for tedious people. I want to dance and laugh and feel alive. I want to choose my own life. "Then tell father," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Tell him you have changed your mind. Break the engagement. It is not too late." "It is too late," she said, and tears were streaming down her face now, catching the moonlight like diamonds. "The contracts are signed. The guests are arriving. The scandal would destroy us all. Father would disown me. Mother would never forgive me. And you, sweet Eleanor, you would pay the price for my cowardice. No, there is only one way out." And that was when she told me her plan. That was when she asked the impossible thing, the unforgivable thing, the thing that would change both our lives forever. She had a young man, she said, a captain in the army, handsome and charming and entirely unsuitable, who had promised to elope with her to Scotland, where they could marry and be free. He would be waiting for her at dawn, outside the village, with horses and enough money to reach the border. All she needed was time. All she needed was someone to stand in her place at the altar long enough for her to escape, for the ceremony to begin, for it to be too late for anyone to go after her. "We are twins," she said, gripping my hand so tightly it hurt. No one will know the difference, not until the vows are spoken and the register is signed. And then it will be too late. The marriage will be legal, and the Duke will have his Duchess, and Father will have his alliance, and no one will be ruined. You can explain it was an accident, a last-minute confusion, a tragic mistake. You are so good, Eleanor, so sensible and calm. They will forgive you where they would never forgive me. You will weather the scandal and go on with your life, and I will be free. I should have said no. God knows I should have refused absolutely and immediately and without hesitation. But I looked at my sister, my twin, my other half, and I saw genuine desperation in her eyes. I saw the wild, trapped look of an animal in a snare, and I remembered every time I had stepped aside for her, every time I had been the reasonable one, the invisible one, the one who made things easier for everyone else. And beneath that, hidden in a place I barely acknowledged even to myself, was a darker thought, a shameful thought. For just one morning, I would stand in the sunlight. For just 1 hour, I would wear that beautiful dress and speak those ancient vows and know what it felt like to be chosen, even if it was all a lie. So I said yes. I said yes. And I held her while she wept with relief, and I listened as she explained exactly when to leave my room, exactly which door to use, exactly how to style my hair and hold my bouquet and walk down the aisle. And then she was gone, slipping away into the darkness like a dream I was already forgetting. And I was alone with my choice and my fear, and the terrible certainty that I had just stepped off a cliff into empty air. I did not sleep that night. I lay in bed and watched the darkness slowly lighten beyond my window, watched the stars fade one by one like candles being snuffed, and I thought about what I was about to do. I thought about the Duke, about the man I knew only through letters and stolen glances, about how he would feel when he discovered the deception. I thought about my parents, about the explosion of rage and shame that would come. I thought about myself, about who I would be after this morning, about whether I would ever again recognize the face in my mirror. When the maid came to wake Vivienne for her wedding day, I rose instead. I bathed in the water meant for my sister, put on the undergarments and chemise that had been laid out, sat still while they dressed my hair in the elaborate style that had been practiced a dozen times. The wedding gown slid over my head like a whisper, the silk cool against my skin, the weight of it settling on my shoulders like destiny. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw Vivienne looking back, and I wondered if this was how she had always felt, wearing a costume, playing a part, being someone other than herself. The carriage ride to the church passed in a blur. My mother sat across from me, her eyes bright with tears of joy, telling me how proud Father was, how fortunate I was, how I must remember to smile and speak clearly and conduct myself with the dignity befitting a duchess. I nodded and murmured, "Yes, Mama," and stared out the window at the countryside rolling past, golden in the autumn morning, beautiful and indifferent to the chaos in my heart. The church was ancient and cold, smelling of stone and candle wax and the flowers that had been brought in to decorate the pews. I stood in the vestibule and listened to the organ playing, to the rustle and murmur of the assembled guests, and I felt as though I were watching myself from a great distance. This is not real, I told myself. This is a performance, a temporary madness, and soon it will be over. But then the music changed, the great doors opened, and I was walking down the aisle on my father's arm. I was walking toward the altar where the Duke stood waiting, tall and dark and unsmiling in his formal clothes. I was walking toward the priest with his open prayer book and his solemn expression. I was walking into my sister's life, into her future, into a fate that had never been meant for me. The Duke did not look at me as I approached. His eyes were fixed on some point above my head, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked like a man fulfilling an obligation, enduring a necessary ordeal, and I felt a strange pang of sympathy for him. He had not asked for this any more than I had. He too was caught in the machinery of duty and expectation, grinding forward toward a destination neither of us had chosen. I took my place beside him, and the ceremony began. The priest's voice rolled over us in sonorous Latin and English, the ancient words worn smooth by centuries of repetition. I heard them as though from underwater, distant and distorted. I felt the Duke's presence beside me like a wall of stone, cold and unyielding. I held my bouquet of white roses so tightly that I felt a thorn pierce my thumb through my glove, and I welcomed the small, sharp pain because it was real, because it was something I could feel and name. And then came the moment when the vows were to be exchanged, when names were to be spoken, when the register was to be signed. The priest looked at me with his kind, rheumy eyes, and he smiled, and he said the words that would seal my fate. "Do you, Vivian Catherine Hartley, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" And that was when everything shattered. That was when a voice rang out from the back of the church, clear and horrified and impossible to ignore. That was when my mother screamed. That was when I turned and saw my sister standing in the doorway, still in her traveling cloak, her face white with shock, her hand pressed to her mouth as though to hold back more words. She should have been miles away by now, safe on the road to Scotland. But something had gone wrong. The captain had not come, or he had come too late. Or she had lost her nerve at the last moment. And now she stood there, Vivian in truth, the real bride, staring at her own ghost standing at the altar in her wedding gown. The church erupted in chaos, voices rising in confusion and outrage, people standing and pointing and demanding explanations. My father's roar of fury cutting through it all like thunder, my mother sobbing, the guests gasping and whispering and craning their necks to see better. But I heard none of it. I heard only the Duke's voice, low and terrible and cold as death, speaking into the sudden silence that fell when he raised one hand. "What is the meaning of this?" The priest, good man that he was, looked from me to my sister and back again, and understanding dawned on his weathered face. He looked down at the register where I had just signed my name, my real name, and then up at the Duke with genuine sorrow in his eyes. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "I believe you have married the wrong sister." The vows were spoken by Miss Eleanor Hartley, not Miss Vivian as was contracted. The Duke turned to look at me then, really look at me, for the first time since I had joined him at the altar. I watched his face as comprehension swept across it like a wave, as anger kindled in those dark eyes, as his mouth hardened into a line of absolute fury. I saw the moment he understood the deception, the betrayal, the trap that had closed around him. I saw myself reflected in his eyes, not as a person, but as a problem, a disaster, a mistake that could not be unmade. "The ceremony is complete," the priest said gently but firmly. "The vows have been spoken before God and witnesses. The register has been signed. Under the law and before heaven, His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, is married to Miss Eleanor Hartley. The marriage is legal and binding." "No," the Duke said, and his voice was barely a whisper, but it carried through the church like a blade. "No, this cannot stand. It is fraud. It is deception. It is not valid." But it was valid. The priest explained it patiently, regretfully, as my father raged and my mother wept, and my sister stood frozen in the doorway like a statue. The vows had been spoken. The contract was fulfilled. If not in the spirit intended, then certainly in the letter of the law. The marriage was real, legal, unbreakable, except through means that would create a scandal far worse than any simple mix-up of sisters. I stood there in my sister's wedding gown, my sister's veil, my sister's life, and I watched my own life end. I watched the Duke's face close like a door slamming shut. I watched him turn away from me as though I did not exist. I watched him stride down the aisle and out of the church without a backward glance, his footsteps echoing on the stone like the verdict of a judge. The wedding breakfast was canceled. The guests dispersed in a flurry of scandal and speculation that would feed the gossip mills of London for months to come. My father locked himself in his study and would not speak to me. My mother took to her bed with smelling salts and accusations. And Vivian, my sister, my twin, looked at me with something like pity and something like triumph, and told me she was sorry before she disappeared into her room and did not emerge again. I was left alone in the drawing room as the afternoon light failed and the shadows grew long. I was still wearing the wedding gown. No one had thought to help me remove it, or perhaps they simply did not want to touch me to acknowledge what I had become. I sat very still and very straight, my hands folded in my lap, and I waited for whatever came next. What came was a letter, delivered by a footman who would not meet my eyes. Heavy paper, sealed with the Ashford crest, addressed to me in my new name. The Duchess of Ashford. I stared at those words for a long time before I could bring myself to break the seal. The message inside was brief and brutal. I was to present myself at Ashford Hall within the week. A carriage would be sent. I was to bring only what I needed for a prolonged stay. I was not to expect a wedding trip or any of the usual courtesies afforded a new bride. I was to conduct myself with discretion and dignity, to cause no further scandal, and to understand that while I bore his name and title, I would never have his respect, his affection, or his forgiveness. I read it 3 times, each word a stone added to the wall rising between us. And then I folded it carefully and placed it in my reticule, and I went upstairs to pack my things and prepare for my exile to the cold northern house that was now, by law and by God, my home. The carriage that came for me was black as a hearse and just as welcoming. It arrived at dawn on the 7th day after my wedding, pulled by 4 matched horses and driven by a coachman who handed me up without speaking and did not meet my eyes. My father had not come down to see me off. My mother had kissed my cheek with cold lips and told me to remember who I was and where I came from, as though I could ever forget. Vivian had watched from her window, a pale face behind glass, and we had not spoken since that terrible day in the church. I carried with me 2 trunks of belongings, my mother's pearls, and the weight of my own choices. As the carriage rolled north through the autumn countryside, I watched the landscape change beyond the window. The gentle rolling hills of home gave way to rougher terrain, to moors and rocky outcroppings, to forests of bare trees reaching skeletal branches toward a gray sky. It grew colder as we traveled, and I drew my cloak tighter around me and tried not to think of it as an omen. We stopped only to change horses and to allow me brief moments of privacy at coaching inns where the landlords were carefully neutral and the servants whispered behind their hands. I knew what they saw: the scandalous Duchess, the substitute bride, the woman who had trapped the Duke through deception. The story had spread faster than any post-horse could travel, embellished and distorted with each retelling, until I barely recognized myself in the various versions I overheard. In some, I was a cunning schemer who had planned the whole affair. In others, I was a pathetic creature who had been manipulated by my wicked sister. The truth, complicated and painful and human, interested no one. On the 3rd day, we reached the borders of the Ashford estate, and the landscape grew wilder still. The moors stretched endlessly in shades of purple and brown, punctuated by great stones standing like ancient sentinels. The sky pressed down heavy and close, promising rain. There were sheep scattered across the hillsides, white dots against the dark earth, and stone walls running in long lines that divided the land into parcels of belonging. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, and I understood suddenly why the Duke's letters had been full of this place. It was honest. It asked nothing of you except that you endure. Ashford Hall appeared on the horizon like something from a medieval tale. It was built of gray stone, massive and imposing, with towers at each corner and rows of tall windows that caught the fading light. A long drive lined with ancient oaks led to the main entrance, and as we approached, I could see the formal gardens spreading to either side, Autumn bare but clearly magnificent in their season. Everything about it spoke of age, of permanence, of a family that had stood in this place for centuries and intended to stand for centuries more. And I, the unwanted duchess, the accidental bride, was now bound to it for the rest of my life. The carriage stopped before the main doors, and I sat for a moment, gathering my courage, before the coachman opened the door and handed me down. My legs were stiff from travel, my body aching from days of jostling roads, but I forced myself to stand straight and walk steadily up the stone steps. The great doors opened before I reached them, and I stepped into a vast entrance hall that smelled of beeswax and old wood and the faint smokiness of peat fires. A woman was waiting for me. She was perhaps 50, dressed in the black of a housekeeper, with iron-gray hair pulled severely back and a face that might have been handsome once, but had hardened with time into something unreadable. She looked at me with the same careful neutrality I had seen at the coaching inns, and she dropped a brief curtsy that was technically correct, but entirely without warmth. "Your Grace," she said, and the title sounded strange in her mouth, almost mocking. "I am Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper. His Grace is not in residence at present. He left instructions that you are to be shown to the Duchess's chambers and provided with whatever you require. Dinner will be served in your rooms at 8 o'clock, not in residence." The words hit me like a slap, though I should have expected nothing else. Of course he would not be here to greet me. Of course he would arrange to be elsewhere, anywhere, rather than face the woman who had been forced upon him. I swallowed my disappointment and nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood. That will be satisfactory." She turned without another word and led me through a series of corridors and rooms that blurred together in my exhausted state. I had impressions of grandeur, of portraits lining the walls, of furniture that was old and fine and polished to a high shine, of rugs worn thin in the centers from generations of footsteps. We climbed a wide staircase to the second floor and then down another long corridor until we reached a set of double doors at the far end. "The Duchess's apartments," Mrs. Blackwood said, opening the doors to reveal a suite of rooms that took my breath away. The sitting room was beautiful in the way that very old, very expensive things are beautiful. The walls were covered in silk damask, the color of sea foam. The furniture was elegant and graceful, and a fire burned in the marble fireplace, throwing dancing shadows across the ceiling. Tall windows looked out over the gardens and the moors beyond, and the fading afternoon light filled the room with a melancholy golden glow. Through an open doorway, I could see the bedroom beyond, dominated by a massive four-poster bed hung with embroidered curtains. "Your trunks will be brought up shortly," Mrs. Blackwood said. "The bell pull is there if you require anything. His Grace's rooms are in the East Wing. You will not have occasion to visit them." The last sentence was delivered with the faintest emphasis, a warning and a dismissal all at once. I understood. These were my rooms, my domain, my prison. I was to stay here, out of sight and out of mind, the Duchess in name only, granted the trappings of position, but none of its substance. "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwood. That will be all." She left me then, closing the doors with a soft click that sounded terribly final. I stood in the center of that beautiful room and felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. I wanted to cry, but I could not seem to summon the tears. I wanted to rage, but I had no one to rage at except myself. So instead, I walked to the windows and looked out at the darkening moors, at the vast empty spaces that mirrored the vast empty spaces inside me, and I wondered how long I could endure this. The days that followed established a pattern that varied little. I woke early, breakfasted alone in my rooms, and then walked the corridors and rooms of Ashford Hall like a ghost haunting her own life. The house was enormous, far larger than I had imagined, and I could wander for hours without seeing another soul, beyond the occasional servant who would freeze when they saw me and drop a curtsy before hurrying away. No one spoke to me unless spoken to. No one met my eyes. I was the Duchess, yes, But I was also the scandal, the mistake, the woman who did not belong. I found the library on my third day, and it became my refuge. It was a magnificent room, 2 stories high with a gallery running around the upper level and windows that filled the space with light. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with books, thousands of them, more than I had ever seen in one place. I ran my fingers along the spines and felt something in my chest ease slightly. Here at least was company, conversation, escape from the endless silence of my own thoughts. I began to spend my days there, reading by the fire, losing myself in other lives and other stories. I read novels and poetry and histories. I read the agricultural treatises and estate management books that lined one entire section, trying to understand the land that I now belonged to. And I read letters, old letters tied with faded ribbons and stored in boxes on the lower shelves, letters between past dukes and duchesses, between fathers and sons, between lovers and friends. They made me ache with longing for connection, for the simple human intimacy of words shared between 2 people who cared for each other. It was in the library that I found the first clue to the man I had married. I had been there perhaps a week when I noticed a desk in the corner, clearly in use, with papers and ledgers stacked neatly and a pen resting in its stand. I should not have looked. I knew it was an invasion of his privacy. But I was so desperate for some understanding of him, some glimpse behind the wall of cold fury he had shown me, that I could not help myself. The papers were estate business, accounts and reports from his steward, nothing very personal or revealing. But beneath them, almost hidden, was a leather journal with no lock and no label. I picked it up with trembling hands and opened it to the first page. His handwriting, I recognized it from the letters he had written, the letters I had answered in my sister's name. Strong and angular, like the man himself. It was not a diary in the traditional sense. There were no daily entries about weather or social calls or minor grievances. Instead, there were observations, reflections, fragments of thought written down as though he were trying to work through something difficult or painful. I read one entry, then another, and with each line I felt my understanding shift and deepen. He wrote about duty and the crushing weight of it, about inheriting the dukedom at 23 when his father died unexpectedly, about being thrust into a role he was not ready for and could not refuse, about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted things from him, who saw him as a title rather than a man, about his engagement to Vivian, about his hope that perhaps this time he had found someone who might understand, who might be a true partner rather than another person to be managed and provided for. And then, more recent, there was an entry written in a hand less controlled than usual, as though emotion had made it unsteady. About the wedding day, about standing at that altar and feeling the first stirrings of optimism, thinking that perhaps this marriage might not be the empty formality he had feared, about the priest's words and the terrible realization of what had been done to him, about betrayal that cut deeper than any blade because it proved that he had been right all along, that no one wanted him, only what he could provide. I closed the journal with shaking hands and returned it to its place. I felt as though I had stolen something precious and breakable, as though I had seen him naked and vulnerable in a way he would never have permitted. But I also felt the first stirrings of something that was not quite guilt and not quite sympathy, but some painful mixture of both. He had been wounded too. He had been deceived too. And while I had not planned it, while I had been as much a victim of circumstance as he, I was also the face of that betrayal. I was the living reminder that he had been tricked, trapped, forced into a bond he had not chosen with a woman he had not wanted. The Duke returned to Ashford Hall on a cold November evening 3 weeks after my arrival. I was in the library when I heard the commotion of horses and voices from the drive. My heart began to pound, and I stood frozen, book in hand, as I listened to his footsteps enter the house, heard his voice speaking to the servants, heard him come closer and closer down the corridor toward the library. The door opened, and he stood there, tall and dark and travel-worn, his greatcoat still beaded with rain from the weather outside. He stopped when he saw me, and for a long moment we simply looked at each other. I saw him taking in my presence in his library, my hand on his books, my existence in his house. I saw his jaw tighten and his eyes grow hard, and I braced myself for anger, for recriminations, for the words that would put me firmly in my place. But what he said was, "I did not expect to find you here." His voice was quiet, controlled, but I heard the edge beneath it. I set down the book carefully and clasped my hands in front of me to keep them from shaking. "I apologize if I intruded, Your Grace. I was not informed which rooms I was permitted to occupy. It was petty of me, that small barb, that reminder that I had been left alone and uninstructed in his house for nearly a month. But I was tired of being silent, tired of accepting every slight and coldness without acknowledgement. I saw something flicker in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or grudging respect for the small act of defiance. "You are the Duchess of Ashford," he said after a pause. "You may occupy any rooms you wish. I simply did not expect you to choose the library." "I have always preferred books to people," I said. "They are more honest and less likely to cause disappointment." A ghost of something that might have been amusement crossed his face, gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Then you are well suited to Ashford Hall. There are few people here, and many books." He moved into the room then, walking past me toward his desk as though I were a piece of furniture, something to be noted and then ignored. I watched him remove his gloves and greatcoat, watched him rifle through the papers on the desk with familiar ease. He did not look at me again, but I could feel his awareness of my presence like a physical thing. "I should go," I said finally, hating the uncertainty in my own voice. "I will leave you to your work. Stay if you wish. I am only checking correspondence before I change for dinner." The words were casual, almost indifferent, but they stopped me at the door. I turned back and found him watching me with an expression I could not read. "Will you be dining in the main dining room, Your Grace?" "I will. It seems foolish to maintain separate establishments when we are both in residence. The servants will lay 2 places. It was not an invitation, not exactly, but neither was it a dismissal. It was, I realized, the closest thing to an olive branch he was likely to offer. I nodded and left before he could change his mind, my heart racing as I hurried back to my rooms to prepare for my first meal in my husband's presence. Mrs. Blackwood helped me dress for dinner, her hands efficient and impersonal as she laced me into a gown of deep blue silk that had been part of my trousseau. She arranged my hair and fastened my mother's pearls around my neck, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw a woman who resembled a duchess, who looked elegant and composed, and entirely unlike the frightened girl who had stood at that altar and spoken vows meant for someone else. The dining room was on the ground floor, a long room with a table that could easily seat 30, but was set tonight only at one end with 2 places facing each other. Candles burned in silver candelabra, casting warm light over fine china and crystal glasses. The Duke was already there when I entered, changed into evening clothes, standing by the fireplace with a glass of what looked like whiskey in his hand. He turned when he heard me, and his eyes traveled over me in a quick, assessing glance before he looked away. "Madame," he said, and gestured to the chair that had been pulled out for me. We sat, and the first course was served, a clear soup that I barely tasted. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable, broken only by the clink of spoons against porcelain and the crackle of the fire. I searched for something to say, some way to bridge the impossible distance, but everything I thought of seemed inadequate or inappropriate, or likely to make things worse. It was he who spoke first, his voice carefully neutral. "I trust you have found your accommodations satisfactory." "Very satisfactory, thank you. The Duchess's apartments are beautiful. They were my mother's. She died when I was 10. I am sorry." He shrugged slightly, a gesture that seemed to dismiss both my sympathy and the memory. "It was long ago. She would have liked you, I think. She was fond of books as well. It was such an unexpected thing to say, such a small offering of connection, that I did not know how to respond. I looked across the table at him and saw him staring down at his plate, his face unreadable in the candlelight. "The letters," I said suddenly, before I could stop myself. "The ones you wrote during the courtship." I answered them. "I know." He looked up then, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. I realized it some time ago. The voice was different, the thoughts were different. Vivian's letters before we met were superficial, full of the expected pleasantries and little else. But after my third visit, they changed. They became thoughtful, engaged, curious about things that matter. I assumed she had finally decided to make an effort. "It was you all along." "Yes." I dropped my gaze, ashamed. "I am sorry. I should not have deceived you. Should you not?" There was no anger in his voice, only a terrible weariness. "It seems deception runs in your family. Or perhaps it is simply that I am easy to deceive, too willing to believe that someone might actually want to know me rather than simply want what I can provide." "I did want to know you," I said, and my voice was barely above a whisper. "Those letters, those exchanges, they were the best part of my days. I looked forward to everyone. I told you things I had never told anyone, thoughts I had never been encouraged to voice. When I wrote to you, I felt seen in a way I had never been seen before." He was silent for a long time, studying me with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Then you must have been bitterly disappointed to find yourself actually married to me," he said finally. "To be trapped in this cold house with a man who wants nothing more than to be left alone." "I am not disappointed," I said, and I was surprised to find it was true. "I am frightened. I am uncertain. I am ashamed of the circumstances. But I am not disappointed in you." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor, a glimpse of the complicated, wounded man beneath the cold exterior. But before either of us could say anything more, before that fragile moment could become something real, a servant entered with the next course, and the spell was broken. We finished the meal in silence, the brief connection lost, or perhaps simply too dangerous to pursue. When the last course was cleared and the port was brought, the Duke stood and inclined his head in a gesture that was formal and final. "Thank you for your company, Duchess. I bid you good night." And he was gone, leaving me alone at the long table with the candles burning down and the firelight throwing shadows, wondering if I had imagined that moment of understanding or if it had been as real and as fragile as I thought. I sat there for a long time, thinking about letters and deceptions and the strange, terrible fate that had bound two lonely people together in a marriage neither had wanted. And I wondered, for the first time, if perhaps there might be some small hope for us after all. The weeks that followed brought a routine of cautious coexistence. We dined together most evenings, conversations that were careful and limited, but no longer entirely silent. We passed each other in corridors and nodded politely. We shared the library, he at his desk and I in my chair by the window, existing in the same space without intruding on each other's solitude. But there was something growing between us, something I could not quite name. I caught him watching me sometimes when he thought I was absorbed in my book. I found small courtesies that had not been there before. A cushion placed on my favorite chair, a new novel left on the table beside it, the fire always lit and burning well when I arrived. They were tiny things, easily dismissed, but they made my heart ache with cautious hope. And then came the morning when everything changed again. I had been at Ashford Hall nearly 2 months when I woke feeling ill, a persistent nausea that sent me rushing to the wash basin. I dismissed it at first as something I had eaten, but when it happened again the next morning and the next, I began to understand with growing horror what it might mean. I was carrying his child. The child of a man who barely tolerated my presence, conceived on a wedding night I could not remember because he had been drunk, and I had been terrified, and it had been over before I could fully comprehend what was happening. A child that would bind us together forever, that would make this reluctant marriage permanent and inescapable in ways that even the law had not. I told no one at first, hoping desperately that I was wrong, that it was some other ailment that would pass. But my courses did not come, and my body began to change in small but undeniable ways, and I knew I could not hide it much longer. I would have to tell him. I would have to see his face when he learned that the trap he was caught in had just closed tighter, and I did not know if I had the courage to bear whatever I saw there. I told him on a December evening, when snow was falling beyond the windows and the wind howled across the moors like something alive and hungry. We had finished dinner, and I had requested that he remain, that he not retreat to his study or his own rooms, as he usually did. He had looked at me with surprise and something that might have been concern, and he had stayed, settling into the chair across from me with a glass of port cradled in his long fingers. "I have something I must tell you," I said, and my voice sounded strange even to my own ears, too high and too tight, "something that will affect us both." He set down his glass with careful precision, and I watched his face close like shutters being drawn. Whatever wariness had existed between us, whatever fragile peace we had achieved, I was about to shatter it. I could see him bracing himself for another betrayal, another deception, another blow. "I am with child," I said, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "Your child. I am perhaps 2 months along, perhaps slightly more. I wanted to be certain before I told you." He did not move. He did not speak. He simply sat there staring at me with an expression I could not read, as though I had spoken in a language he did not understand. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the stillness, marking the seconds that stretched between us like an ocean. "Say something," I whispered finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. "Please. What would you have me say?" His voice, when it came, was flat, emotionless, more frightening than anger would have been. That I am pleased? That I am grateful for this further entanglement in a marriage I never wanted? That I welcome the prospect of a child born from deception and duty? Each word was a blade, and I felt them cutting. But I forced myself to meet his eyes, to not look away from the pain I had caused. "I understand your feelings. I do not blame you for them. But the child is innocent of all this. Whatever exists between us, whatever you feel for me, the child deserves better than your resentment." Something flickered across his face then, something that might have been shame or regret. He stood abruptly and walked to the window, turning his back to me, his shoulders rigid with tension. "You are right," he said after a long moment. "The child is innocent, and you, I suppose, are not entirely to blame for this situation. It takes two to create a life, and I was present that night, even if I have done my best to forget it." I flinched at the casual cruelty of that, at the reminder that our wedding night had been something he wished to erase from memory. But I understood it too. We had been strangers then, bound by law but not by choice, and what had passed between us had been mechanical and joyless, a duty fulfilled and nothing more. "What do you want from me?" he asked, still not turning to face me. "What do you expect?" "I expect nothing," I said quietly. "I ask only that you do not punish the child for the sins of its parents. I ask that you acknowledge it, provide for it, treat it with the kindness you would show any innocent creature. Beyond that, I make no demands on you." He turned then, and I saw something raw and unguarded in his face, something that looked almost like grief. "You make no demands because you have learned not to expect anything from me. Because I have been cold and cruel and utterly failing in every duty a husband owes his wife. God help me, Eleanor. I have been punishing you for a crime you did not commit, hating you for a deception that was not your idea, treating you as an enemy when you have been nothing but civil and patient and far kinder than I deserve." It was the first time he had used my name, the first time he had spoken to me as though I were a person rather than a problem to be managed. And hearing the anguish in his voice and seeing the conflict in his eyes, I felt something shift in my chest, some softening toward this difficult, damaged man who was now bound to me forever. I stood and moved toward him, not too close but close enough that he could see I meant what I was about to say. We have both been victims in this, Your Grace. We have both been trapped by circumstances beyond our control. But we have a choice now about what happens next. We can continue as we have been, existing in the same house but leading separate lives, bound by law but strangers in every way that matters. Or we can try to build something real from these broken pieces. Not love, perhaps, not yet, maybe not ever, but respect, partnership, the kind of marriage that might give our child a home rather than a battlefield. He studied me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing my words, considering possibilities he had perhaps not allowed himself to imagine. Then he reached out slowly, tentatively, and took my hand. It was the first time he had touched me with anything resembling gentleness since our wedding day, and the warmth of his fingers around mine made my breath catch. "I do not know if I am capable of what you are suggesting," he said quietly. "I have been alone for so long, armored for so long, that I am not certain I remember how to let anyone close. But for the child's sake, and perhaps for yours as well, I am willing to try." "That is all I ask," I said, and I squeezed his hand gently before releasing it. "That you try." He nodded slowly, and something in his face eased, some of the terrible tension draining away. "Then I must ask something of you in return. I must ask that you be patient with me, that you forgive my coldness and my cruelty these past months, that you understand it came from hurt and not from any genuine malice toward you." "I forgive you," I said simply, "and I ask the same patience and forgiveness in return for all the ways I have failed you, knowingly or not." We stood there in the candlelight, two wounded people who had been thrown together by fate and were now trying to find some way forward through the wreckage. It was not a grand romantic moment. There were no declarations of love or passionate embraces, but it was honest and it was real, and it was more than we had had before. The weeks that followed brought subtle changes. The Duke, I learned his given name was Richard, though I still could not bring myself to use it, began to take an interest in my well-being that went beyond mere duty. He inquired about my health, ensured that the doctor was called to examine me, arranged for Mrs. Blackwood to provide whatever I needed for my comfort. He did not exactly become warm, but the coldness thawed to something more like careful courtesy. We continued to dine together, and the conversations grew longer and less guarded. He told me about the estate, about the tenants and the land, and the weight of responsibility he carried. I told him about my childhood, about growing up in my sister's shadow, about the strange loneliness of being a twin, but always feeling alone. We discovered shared interests, books we had both read, opinions we held in common, small jokes that made the corners of his mouth lift in something almost like a smile. He began to join me in the library more often, no longer confining himself to his desk, but sitting near me, reading his own book or reviewing his correspondence while I worked on my embroidery, or read aloud from whatever novel I was currently engrossed in. Sometimes hours would pass in comfortable silence, the only sounds the turning of pages and the crack of the fire. It was companionable, peaceful, and I found myself looking forward to these quiet evenings more than I cared to admit. And slowly, carefully, he began to ask about the pregnancy. Not about the logistics or the practical matters that Mrs. Blackwood was handling with efficient thoroughness, but about how I felt, what I was experiencing, whether I was frightened or excited or some mixture of both. I answered honestly, telling him about the strangeness of feeling my body change, about the nausea that had finally passed and the fatigue that sometimes overwhelmed me, about the fluttering sensation I had begun to feel that the doctor assured me was the baby moving. "May I?" he asked one evening in late January, gesturing hesitantly toward my midsection where my gown was beginning to strain against the gentle swell of my growing belly. I nodded, too surprised to speak, and he reached out and placed his hand carefully, reverently, against the curve. We stayed like that for several minutes, barely breathing, waiting. And then it happened, a distinct flutter against his palm, the baby moving beneath his touch. I saw his face transform, saw wonder and fear, and something tender break through his careful control. And I knew in that moment that whatever he felt or did not feel for me, he would love this child. Remarkable, he whispered, his hand still pressed gently against me. A life we created. A person who will exist because of choices we made, however inadvertent those choices were. Yes, I said softly, a person who deserves the best of both of us, not the worst. He looked up at me then, his hand still cradling our child, and something passed between us, some wordless understanding that we were in this together now, that whatever had been broken between us, we would have to find a way to mend it, if not for our own sakes, then for the innocent life growing between us. The winter deepened, and the estate settled into the quiet rhythm of the cold months. I took to walking in the gardens when the weather permitted, bundled in furs and following the paths that wound between dormant flower beds and bare trees. Richard sometimes accompanied me, his long strides shortened to match my slower pace, pointing out features of the landscape and telling me stories about his childhood adventures in these same gardens. One afternoon as we walked, he told me about his parents, about the love match they had made against his grandfather's wishes, about how happy they had been in the too few years they had together before his mother died. He told me about becoming duke so young, about the terror of inheriting such responsibility when he barely understood what it meant, about the loneliness of never being able to show weakness or ask for help. I had always planned to marry for love, he said, his breath misting in the cold air. I had seen what my parents had, and I wanted that for myself. But after my father died and I inherited, I realized that love was a luxury I could not afford. I needed a wife who understood duty, who could handle the social obligations, who would give me an heir and not make demands I could not meet. When I met Vivienne, I thought perhaps I could have both. She was beautiful and charming, and her letters, or what I thought were her letters, suggested a mind I could respect. I allowed myself to hope, and then to discover it was all a lie, that even that small hope was built on deception. It broke something in me. I am sorry, I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. I am sorry for my part in that deception, however unintentional. I am sorry that you were hurt. And I am sorry that I am not the woman you wanted. He stopped walking and turned to face me, his expression serious. You are not the woman I thought I wanted, he said carefully. But you may be the woman I need. You are patient and kind, and you do not expect me to be anything other than what I am. You read voraciously and think deeply and challenge me in ways that are uncomfortable but necessary. You have endured my coldness and my cruelty with a grace I do not deserve. And you are carrying my child, our child, with a courage that humbles me. So no, Eleanor, you are not Vivienne. Thank God you are not Vivienne. The words hit me like a physical blow, unexpected and overwhelming. I felt tears prick my eyes, and I blinked them back fiercely, not wanting to weep in front of him. But he saw them anyway, and something softened in his face. Come, he said gently, taking my arm. You are cold and tired, and I have kept you out too long. Let us return to the house. We walked back in silence, but it was a different silence than before, warmer somehow, less fraught with unspoken accusations and resentments. And when we reached the entrance, and he handed me up the steps with careful solicitude, I felt the first stirrings of something that might, given time and patience, grow into affection. February brought news from the outside world that I had been dreading. A letter arrived from my mother, the first communication I had received from my family since my departure. I held it in my hands for a long time before I could bring myself to break the seal, knowing that whatever it contained would be painful. I was right. The letter was cold and formal, informing me that Vivian had married her captain in a hasty ceremony in Scotland, and they had removed to his posting in India, where she would be beyond the reach of scandal. My father was still furious, my mother wrote, and refused to speak Vivian's name or acknowledge her existence. As for me, I had saved the family from complete ruin by going through with the marriage, but I was not to expect forgiveness or any resumption of normal familial relations. I had made my choice, the letter concluded, and I must live with the consequences. I read it twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in the drawer of my writing desk. I felt surprisingly little. Not anger, not grief, just a distant sort of sadness for the family that had been and was no more. They had always preferred Vivian. I had always known that. And now that she was gone, they blamed me for not being her, for not saving them in the way they had wanted to be saved. It was almost funny in a bleak sort of way. Richard found me later that day in the library, staring out the window at the gray sky without really seeing it. He did not ask what was wrong, but simply sat beside me in his usual chair and waited. After a while, I told him about the letter, about my family's rejection, about the strange relief I felt at being finally and completely free of them. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I know what it is to lose family, even family that was never quite what you needed them to be. But you are not alone, Eleanor. You have a home here, a place here, a family here if you will accept it." I looked at him in surprise. "A family?" "This child," he said, gesturing toward my swelling middle, "and me, such as I am. We are your family now, imperfect and complicated and nothing like what either of us planned, but a family nonetheless." Something broke open in my chest at those words, some tightly held knot of fear and loneliness finally releasing. I reached for his hand without thinking, and he took it without hesitation, his fingers warm and steady around mine. "Thank you," I whispered, "for trying, for not giving up on this, even when it would have been easier to do so." "I gave up on easier a long time ago," he said with a faint smile. "Besides, you make it rather difficult to maintain my carefully cultivated coldness. You are terribly stubborn about insisting I behave like a decent human being." I laughed at that, actually laughed, and I saw answering amusement in his eyes. It was the first moment of genuine lightness between us, the first time we had shared something that felt like real companionship rather than cautious coexistence. The months passed, and spring came slowly to the northern moors. The snow melted, revealing green beneath, and the first flowers began to appear in the gardens. My body grew heavier and more ungainly, and I moved through the halls of Ashford Hall with increasing slowness, one hand always pressed to my aching back. Richard became more attentive as my time drew near, insisting I rest more, reading to me when I was too tired to hold a book, even carrying me up the stairs one evening when I was too exhausted to climb them myself. "You need not coddle me," I told him, embarrassed by the intimacy of being held in his arms. "I am not an invalid. You are carrying my air," he said mildly. "I am allowed to coddle you if I wish. Besides, you weigh next to nothing. It is hardly an inconvenience." But it was more than that, and we both knew it. Somewhere in the months since I had told him about the baby, somewhere in the long winter evenings and the quiet conversations and the slow building of trust, we had become something more than reluctant spouses. Not lovers, not yet, perhaps not ever, but friends, partners, two people learning to navigate this strange life together and finding, against all odds, that they did not entirely hate each other's company. The pains began on a wet April morning when the world was greening and the birds were singing their mating songs. I woke before dawn with an ache in my back that quickly spread and sharpened into something undeniable. I knew what it meant, and I was terrified. Not of the pain, though that would come soon enough, but of what lay ahead, of the terrible risk that every woman took when she brought a child into the world. I sent for Mrs. Blackwood and the doctor, and I sent for Richard, though I did not know if he would come. Childbirth was women's business after all, and most men kept well away until it was over and they could be assured of the outcome. But he came, appearing in my doorway still in his shirt sleeves and waistcoat, his face pale but determined. "You should not be here," I told him, as another contraction gripped me and stole my breath. "This is not a place for men." "I am staying," he said firmly, coming to my bedside and taking my hand. "You have endured this marriage alone for too long. You will not endure this alone as well." And so he stayed. Through the long hours of labor, through the pain that came in waves and consumed everything, through my screams and tears and the terrible fear that I would not survive this. He stayed, holding my hand and speaking words I could not quite hear, but that soothed nonetheless, refusing to leave even when the midwife scolded him and Mrs. Blackwood looked scandalized. And when our daughter finally entered the world, small and red and howling with indignation, it was Richard who cut the cord with trembling hands, who wrapped her in the blanket that had been warming by the fire, who placed her in my arms and looked at us both with such naked wonder and terror and fierce protective love that I felt my heart crack open completely. "She is perfect," he whispered, one finger gently stroking her impossibly tiny hand. "Absolutely perfect." I looked down at our daughter, at the fragile miracle we had created, and I felt something shift and settle into place. This was my family now. This man with his walls slowly crumbling. This child with her fierce will to live. Not the family I had imagined in my girlhood dreams, but a family nonetheless, real and complicated and mine. We named her Catherine, after his mother, and she became the center of our world. Richard surprised everyone, most of all himself, by being a devoted father who spent hours in the nursery holding her, talking to her, watching her sleep as though she might disappear if he looked away. I watched him with our daughter and saw the man he had been before duty and loss had hardened him, and I found myself falling, slowly and terrifyingly, into something that felt dangerously close to love. Catherine's arrival transformed Ashford Hall in ways I had not anticipated. The silent corridors filled with the sounds of her cries and coos. The nursery became the most important room in the house, and Richard, my reserved and dutiful husband, became someone I barely recognized. He would cancel meetings to spend time with her, would carry her through the gardens, pointing out flowers and birds as though she could understand, would read to her from his favorite books in that deep, quiet voice that made her blink up at him with solemn dark eyes so like his own. "I am making a fool of myself," he said one evening, as I found him in the nursery long after Catherine had fallen asleep, still sitting beside her cradle and watching her breathe. "The servants think I have lost my mind. Dukes do not spend their days in nurseries." "This duke does," I said softly, coming to stand beside him, "and Catherine is fortunate for it. She will grow up knowing her father's love, not just his name and title." He looked up at me then, and in the dim light of the single candle, I saw something vulnerable and wondering in his face. "I never knew it could be like this," he said. "When my father spoke of having an heir, it was always about duty, about securing the succession, about continuing the family line. He never mentioned this feeling as though your heart is walking around outside your body in the most fragile vessel imaginable. I would kill for her, Eleanor. I would die for her. And she does not even know I exist beyond the arms that hold her and the voice that soothes her." "She knows," I assured him. "Babies know more than we give them credit for. She knows she is loved and safe, and that is the greatest gift you can give her." We both stood there looking down at our daughter, and I felt the weight and beauty of what we had created, not just the child, but this moment, this shared tenderness that neither of us had expected or planned for. And when Richard reached out and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The summer months passed in a haze of new motherhood and gradually shifting dynamics. I was no longer the unwanted duchess, the mistake that had to be endured. I was Catherine's mother, Richard's partner in this overwhelming task of raising a child, and slowly, carefully, I was becoming something more. I saw it in the way he looked at me now when I entered a room, no longer with cold assessment, but with something warmer. I felt it in the casual touches that had begun to appear, his hand on my shoulder as he passed my chair, his fingers brushing mine when he handed me something, the way he stood close enough that I could feel the warmth of him. But there was still a distance between us, a final wall that neither of us seemed willing or able to breach. We were affectionate now, companionable, but not intimate. He had not come to my bed since our wedding night, had not attempted any physical closeness beyond those brief touches and the holding of hands. Part of me was relieved, remembering the awkwardness and pain of that first encounter. But another part of me, a part that grew stronger with each passing day, wanted more, wanted to know what it might be like to lie with him now, when we knew each other, when there was genuine care between us, when the act might mean something beyond duty and obligation. I did not know how to broach the subject. I had been raised to believe that ladies did not speak of such things, did not express desire, did not initiate physical contact with their husbands. But I had also been raised to be obedient and invisible, and I had broken those rules the moment I stepped into that wedding gown. Perhaps it was time to break another. The opportunity came on a warm August evening when Catherine had been particularly fussy, and I had spent hours walking with her, singing to her, trying everything I could think of to soothe her. Richard had been away on estate business all day, and when he finally returned and found me exhausted and near tears in the nursery, he simply took Catherine from my arms and settled her against his shoulder with the practiced ease he had developed over the past months. "Go," he said gently. "Bathe, rest, have dinner sent to your rooms. I will stay with her until she sleeps." I was too tired to argue, too grateful for the reprieve to do anything but nod and retreat to my chambers. Mrs. Blackwood helped me out of my gown and into a bath that had been prepared, and I sank into the hot water with a groan of relief. My body ached in ways I was still not accustomed to, my breasts heavy and tender from nursing, my back protesting the hours of walking and rocking. But beneath the physical discomfort was something else, a restlessness that had nothing to do with exhaustion. I thought about Richard as I bathed, about the man he had become over these months, or perhaps the man he had always been beneath the armor he wore. I thought about his laugh, rare but genuine when it came, about the way he listened when I spoke as though my words mattered, about his patience with Catherine and his growing patience with me. I thought about the letters we had exchanged, the connection we had built through words before we ever really met, and I wondered if that connection could be rebuilt now in person, in touch, in the complicated intimacy of shared lives and shared desires. When I emerged from the bath and dressed in my nightgown and wrapper, I did not ring for dinner. Instead, I waited, listening for Richard's footsteps in the corridor, and when I heard them, I opened my door before he could pass. "Is she asleep?" I asked softly. He nodded, pausing in the hallway. "Finally. I think she wore herself out with all that crying." He studied me with concern. "You look exhausted. You should eat something and rest." "I should," I agreed. "But I was hoping you might join me. For dinner, I mean, in my rooms, if that would not be inappropriate." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise and something else, something that made my pulse quicken. "It would not be inappropriate," he said carefully. "You are my wife. But are you certain? You need rest, Eleanor, not company." "I need your company," I said, and I was surprised by my own boldness. These past months have been good, better than I ever hoped. And I find myself wanting, that is, I would like to spend time with you, alone, without Catherine as our intermediary, or the servants hovering, or the constant awareness that we are being watched and judged. He was silent for a long moment, and I saw the conflict playing across his face, desire warring with propriety, with concern for me, with whatever complicated feelings he still harbored about our marriage and how it had begun. Then he nodded slowly. "Let me change out of these dusty clothes. I will return shortly." He was back within 20 minutes, dressed in shirt sleeves and waistcoat, his cravat loosened and his hair still damp from washing. Dinner was brought and laid out on the small table in my sitting room, and we ate together as the sun set beyond the windows and filled the room with golden light. We talked about Catherine, about the estate, about the book I had been reading, and the letter he had received from his steward about crop yields and tenant concerns. It was comfortable and easy, the conversation flowing naturally as it had begun to do. But beneath it was an undercurrent of awareness, of possibility, that made my skin feel too tight and my breath come slightly faster. I saw him watching my hands as I lifted my wine glass, saw his eyes follow the line of my throat when I tilted my head back to drink. I felt the tension building between us like a summer storm gathering on the horizon, electric and inevitable. When the meal was finished and the servants had cleared away the dishes, we moved to sit by the fire even though the evening was warm. I curled into my usual chair and Richard took his, but instead of opening a book or newspaper as he normally would, he simply looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. "Eleanor," he said finally, his voice low and serious, "I need to say something, and I need you to listen without interrupting, because if I stop, I may not find the courage to continue." I nodded, my heart pounding, my hands gripping the arms of my chair. "When we married," he began, "when you became my wife through that terrible accident of fate, I was furious. Not just angry, but enraged in a way I had never been before. I felt betrayed and trapped and humiliated, and I punished you for it. I was cold and cruel, and I treated you as though you were the enemy when you were just as much a victim as I was. I have apologized before, but I do not think I have truly made you understand how deeply I regret that. How ashamed I am of the man I was in those early months." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. "But somewhere in these past months, somewhere between the moment you told me about Catherine and this very evening, something changed. I stopped seeing you as the woman who was not Vivian and started seeing you as Eleanor. As the woman who writes thoughtful letters and reads voraciously and challenges me to be better than I am. As the mother of my child who faces every difficulty with grace and courage. As the person I most want to talk to at the end of every day, and the person whose absence I notice immediately when you are not there." He paused, taking a deep breath, and when he continued, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I am falling in love with you, Eleanor. Perhaps I have been falling for months and was too stubborn or too frightened to admit it, but I can no longer pretend that what I feel for you is simply respect or affection or partnership. It is more than that. It has become everything. I could not breathe. I could not think. I could only stare at him as the words settled into me, rearranging everything I thought I knew about us, about him, about what was possible. And then, before I could find words to respond, he was kneeling before my chair, taking my hands in his, looking up at me with such vulnerability and hope that it broke my heart and remade it all at once. "I know I have no right to ask for your love in return," he said. "I know I have given you little reason to trust me or care for me beyond what duty requires. But I am asking anyway, Eleanor. I am asking if you might someday feel even a fraction of what I feel for you. If you might allow me to court you properly, to win you as I should have done from the beginning. If you might give me the chance to make this marriage something real and true and chosen." The tears came then, hot and fast, spilling down my cheeks before I could stop them. I pulled one hand free and placed it against his face, feeling the slight roughness of stubble, the warmth of skin, the realness of him. "Richard," I whispered, and his name felt like a prayer, like a vow. "I have been falling in love with you since the first letter you wrote, since the first thoughtful question you asked, since the first moment I saw beneath the armor you wear to the wounded, lonely man beneath. I married you against my will, yes, but I would marry you again tomorrow, by choice. I love you. I have loved you longer than I have known you, and I will love you until there is no breath left in my body." He made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. And then he was pulling me down into his arms, and we were kneeling together on the floor in front of the fire, holding each other as though we might disappear if we let go. He kissed me then, and it was nothing like the awkward, perfunctory kiss at our wedding ceremony. It was deep and desperate and tender all at once, tasting of wine and tears and years of loneliness finally ending. We moved to the bed slowly, carefully, learning each other as though for the first time, because in many ways it was the first time. The first time with care and desire and the slow building of pleasure that came from actually wanting to give and receive it. He was gentle and patient, asking permission with every touch, making certain I was comfortable and willing and unafraid. And when we finally came together, it was nothing like that first painful encounter. It was beautiful and intimate and utterly transforming. Afterwards, we lay tangled together in the sheets, my head on his chest and his fingers trailing patterns on my bare shoulder. I felt utterly content, utterly safe, utterly loved in a way I had never imagined possible. "I have a confession," Richard said into the quiet darkness. "Something I have been meaning to tell you but have not found the right moment." I lifted my head to look at him, seeing the seriousness in his expression. "What is it?" "I knew," he said, "about the letters. I knew they were from you and not Vivian almost from the beginning." I stared at him, not comprehending. "What do you mean you knew?" He smiled slightly, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. Vivian's handwriting changed completely after the third letter. The formation of the letters, the pressure of the pen, even the signature looked different. And more than that, the voice changed. The first two letters were superficial and perfunctory, exactly what one would expect from a young woman with no particular interest in her correspondent. But then suddenly there was depth, curiosity, real thought behind the words. It was obvious someone else had taken over the writing. "Then why?" I began, but he placed a finger gently over my lips. "I did not know who at first," he said. "I assumed she had hired someone to ghost write them for her, some companion or secretary. It did not occur to me it might be you until our wedding day, until that moment when I really looked at you for the first time and saw your eyes and recognized something in them. And then the priest spoke your name and everything fell into place. The thoughtful letters, the curious questions, the careful observations. They were all you, Eleanor. They were always you." I felt a strange mixture of relief and confusion and lingering hurt. "Then why were you so angry? Why did you reject me if you knew I was the one who wrote those letters, the one you had been connecting with?" "Because I was a fool," he said simply. "Because I was humiliated and hurt that I had been deceived, that the woman I thought I was marrying did not exist. Because I felt like I had been tricked into wanting someone I was not supposed to want, into caring about someone who was not the person I was contractually bound to marry. And most of all, because I was terrified that if you knew I had valued those letters, that I had been looking forward to meeting their author, you would think I had chosen you after all. That this was some elaborate manipulation rather than the accident and mistake it truly was." "That makes no sense," I said, but I was smiling despite myself. "You rejected me because you were afraid I would think you wanted me?" "I told you I was a fool," he said ruefully. "I have spent most of my adult life armoring myself against disappointment and hurt, and when faced with the possibility of something real, I ran from it. I convinced myself it was better to feel nothing than to risk feeling everything. But you, stubborn, patient, impossible Eleanor, you would not let me hide. You insisted on being kind and thoughtful and present, and eventually you wore down every defense I had. I am very persistent," I agreed, and I kissed him softly. "But Richard, you must promise me something. Anything. No more secrets, no more walls, no more hiding behind duty and propriety, when what you really feel is something else entirely. If we are truly going to make this marriage work, if we are truly going to love each other, it must be with complete honesty." "I promise," he said solemnly. "No more secrets, no more hiding. Just us as we are, complicated and imperfect and completely committed to figuring this out together. We fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other. And I dreamed of letters and libraries and a future that finally looked like something I had chosen rather than something that had been forced upon me. The months that followed were the happiest of my life. Richard was true to his word, courting me as though we were newly engaged rather than married for over a year. He brought me flowers from the gardens, took me on long walks across the moors, read poetry to me by firelight, and made love to me with a tenderness and passion that left me breathless and grateful and utterly convinced that I was the most fortunate woman alive. Catherine thrived, growing from a tiny newborn into a plump, smiling baby who had both her father's dark eyes and something of her mother's quieter temperament. We spent hours with her, the three of us, creating the kind of family both Richard and I had longed for but never quite had. And slowly, gradually, Ashford Hall stopped feeling like a prison or a place of exile and began to feel like home. But happiness, I have learned, is a fragile thing. And just when I began to believe that we had truly overcome the difficulties of our beginning, that nothing could threaten what we had built, fate reminded me that the past is never truly past, that secrets have a way of surfacing when we least expect them. It was late autumn, nearly a year and a half after our wedding, when the letter arrived. I recognized my sister's handwriting immediately, though I had not heard from her since that brief, cold missive from my mother announcing her marriage and departure for India. My hand shook as I broke the seal, some premonition of disaster making my heart race even before I read the first line. The letter was long and rambling, written in obvious distress. Vivian was returning to England. Her captain husband had died of fever, and she was widowed and pregnant and penniless, cast out by his family who blamed her for his ruin. She had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. Our parents had disowned her completely and would not answer her letters. She was begging me, her twin, her sister, to help her, to give her sanctuary, at least temporarily, until she could find some other arrangement. I read the letter 3 times, each time feeling the weight of it grow heavier. I understood the impossible position she was putting me in. To refuse would be to condemn my own sister to poverty and scandal. But to accept would be to bring the woman Richard had originally been meant to marry into our home, into the life we had so carefully built, to force all of us to confront the deception and betrayal that had started everything. I found Richard in his study, going over accounts with his steward. He looked up when I entered, and his expression shifted immediately to concern when he saw my face. "Leave us," he said to the steward, who bowed and retreated quickly. Richard came to me and took my hands. "What has happened? Is it Catherine? Are you unwell?" "I am fine. Catherine is fine." But this, I handed him the letter, feeling numb and terrified. This has happened. I watched his face as he read, saw the tightening of his jaw, the flicker of old anger in his eyes, the conflict as duty and desire warred within him. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. "What do you want to do?" he asked quietly. "I do not know," I admitted. "She is my sister, my twin. We share blood and history, and I cannot simply abandon her to fate no matter what she has done. But I also cannot ask you to welcome her here, to live under the same roof with the woman you were supposed to marry. It is too much. It is unfair to everyone." He was silent for a long moment, staring down at the letter in his hands. Then he looked up at me, and I saw something fierce and determined in his eyes. "She may come," he said. "She may stay here as long as she needs to recover from her loss and prepare for her child. But Eleanor, let me be absolutely clear. I married the right sister. Whatever I once thought I wanted, whatever plans were made, they mean nothing compared to what we have now. Vivian could arrive here as she was 2 years ago, beautiful and charming and everything she ever was, and it would change nothing about how I feel about you." "Are you certain?" I whispered. Because once she is here, once you see her again, you may feel differently. I am certain, he said firmly, and we will face this together, as we face everything. Send word that she may come, and trust, Eleanor, that what we have built is strong enough to withstand even this. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust in the love we had found and the commitment we had made to each other. But as I wrote the letter inviting my sister to Ashford Hall, I could not shake the terrible premonition that we were about to face the greatest test of our marriage, and I was not at all certain we would survive it. Vivienne arrived on a cold November afternoon when the moors were gray and the wind carried the promise of early snow. I watched from the window of my sitting room as the hired carriage made its way up the long drive, and I felt my heart constrict with a complicated mixture of emotions I could not quite name. Love and resentment, pity and fear, sisterly loyalty and wifely protectiveness all tangled together until I could barely breathe. Richard found me there and stood beside me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. "We will get through this," he said quietly. "Whatever happens, we will face it together." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and we went down together to greet my sister. She emerged from the carriage, looking nothing like the golden, laughing girl I remembered. She was thin, almost gaunt, her face pale and drawn with grief and exhaustion. Her black mourning clothes hung loosely on her frame, and her belly showed only the smallest curve of early pregnancy. But her eyes were the same, dark and quick, and taking in everything. And when they landed on me, I saw relief and shame and desperate hope all at once. "Eleanor," she whispered, and then she was stumbling toward me, and I caught her as she nearly fell, holding my sister as she wept against my shoulder. We brought her inside and settled her in one of the guest rooms far from the family wing, close enough that I could attend to her, but distant enough that her presence would not intrude on the life Richard and I had built. The doctor was called to examine her and pronounced her exhausted and malnourished, but otherwise well. She needed rest, good food, and time to heal from her losses, both physical and emotional. For the first few days, she kept to her room, and I visited her morning and afternoon, bringing her meals and sitting with her while she ate. We did not speak much at first. The silence between us was heavy with all the things that had been said and not said, all the hurt and betrayal and complicated love that existed between twins who had never quite understood each other. But slowly, carefully, we began to talk. She told me about her marriage, about the captain who had been charming and passionate and utterly unsuited to the responsibilities of life, about how his family had blamed her when he ran up debts and drank too much and finally died in a fever brought on by his own recklessness, about how she had been left with nothing, not even the small allowance she had expected, cast out with only the clothes on her back and a child growing inside her. "I was so stupid, Eleanor," she said one afternoon as I sat beside her bed with my embroidery. "I thought love would be enough. I thought if I just followed my heart, if I chose passion over duty, everything would work out. But it did not. He was not the man I thought he was, and I was not strong enough to save him from himself. And now I am here, begging mercy from the sister I betrayed, intruding on the life you have built from the wreckage I created." "You did not create it alone," I said quietly. "I made my own choices that morning. I could have refused. I could have told Father the truth and faced the consequences. But I did not. I was complicit in the deception, and I have had to live with that knowledge just as you have." She looked at me with something like wonder. "But you seem happy," she said. "You and the Duke, I thought he would hate you forever for what happened. I thought you would be miserable here. But I see the way he looks at you, Eleanor. I see the way you look at him. You love each other." "Yes," I said simply. "We do. It was not easy, and it did not happen quickly, but yes, we love each other." "I am glad," she whispered, and I heard genuine feeling in her voice. "I am glad that something good came from all of this. You deserve happiness, Eleanor. You always did. I was too selfish to see it before, too caught up in my own wants and needs to notice that you were suffering in my shadow. But I see it now, and I am sorry. I am so deeply, terribly sorry for everything. I forgive you, I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. Not because what she had done was forgivable, but because holding on to anger and resentment was exhausting, and I did not want to carry that weight anymore. We cannot change the past, Vivian. We can only choose what we do with the future we have been given. As the days passed, Vivian grew stronger and began to venture out of her room. She took meals with us, though the conversations were careful and stilted, all of us walking on eggshells around the enormous unspoken truths that filled the room. Richard was unfailingly polite to her, courteous in the way he was with all guests, but distant. He did not engage her in conversation beyond what civility required, and he made certain to always sit beside me, to touch my hand or shoulder frequently, to make it absolutely clear where his affections lay. But I watched Vivian watching him, and I saw the regret in her eyes. Not desire, I did not think she wanted him, not really. But she saw what she had thrown away, what she might have had if she had been capable of valuing substance over excitement. She saw a good man, a devoted father, a loving husband, and she understood finally what she had lost when she ran from that altar. One afternoon, I found her in the nursery, standing beside Catherine's cradle and looking down at my sleeping daughter with an expression of such profound sadness that my heart ached for her. "She is beautiful," Vivian said without looking up. "She has his eyes." "She has his temperament, too," I said softly, coming to stand beside her. "Serious and thoughtful even as a baby. I think she will be formidable when she grows up." Vivian reached out as though to touch Catherine, then pulled her hand back. "May I hold her?" "When she wakes, I mean. I promise to be careful." "Of course," I said, though something in me twisted with a possessiveness I had not known I was capable of feeling. "She is your niece. You have every right to know her." When Catherine woke, we sat together in the nursery, and I placed my daughter in my sister's arms. I watched Vivian cradle her with surprising gentleness, watched her murmur soft words and stroke the baby's dark hair, and I saw tears sliding down her cheeks. "I do not know how to do this," she whispered. "I do not know how to be a mother. I am terrified that I will ruin this child the way I have ruined everything else I have touched." "You will learn," I said firmly, "just as I learned. Just as every woman learns when faced with the enormous responsibility of a new life. And you will not be alone, Vivian. I will help you. We will help you." "Why?" she asked, looking up at me with genuine confusion. "Why would you help me after everything I have done to you?" "Because you are my sister," I said. "Because we shared a womb and a childhood, and whatever else has happened between us, that bond remains. And because I know what it is to feel lost and alone and uncertain of your place in the world. I would not wish that on anyone, least of all the mother of my niece or nephew." She wept then, in earnest, great sobbing tears that shook her thin frame, and I held her as best I could with Catherine between us, and I felt something shift and settle, some old wound finally beginning to heal. It was Richard who found the letters. He came to me one evening in late November with a small wooden box I had never seen before, his face grave and thoughtful. "I was going through some papers in the attic," he said, setting the box on the table between us. "Old correspondence that my father kept. And I found these. I think you should read them." I opened the box with trembling hands and found inside a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon. They were addressed to Vivienne, but in an unfamiliar hand, and when I unfolded the first one, I understood immediately what I was looking at. These were the original letters, the ones written before I had taken over the correspondence. Vivian's letters to Richard, written in her own hand and voice. I read through them quickly, each one making me feel sicker than the last. They were exactly what Richard had described, superficial and perfunctory, full of empty flattery and false enthusiasm. But more than that, they were careless. In one, she mentioned how tedious she found his questions about books and philosophy. In another, she complained to someone else, clearly visible in the margins where she had drafted her response, about how boring he was and how she hoped to change him once they were married. And in the last one, written just days before the wedding, she had crossed out several lines, but they were still readable. Lines about how she was only going through with the marriage for the title and the money. How she planned to spend most of her time in London, away from him and his dreary northern estate. I looked up at Richard with tears in my eyes. "You kept these?" "I kept everything," he said quietly. "I am meticulous about correspondence. I did not read them again after I realized the author had changed. But I kept them because that is what one does with official papers related to a betrothal. But Eleanor, do you see what this means? That she never cared for you at all. That she was planning to deceive you from the beginning in ways far worse than what actually happened." He nodded slowly. "I spent months being angry about the wrong thing. I was furious about the substitution, about marrying you instead of her. But the truth is, Vivian would have made me absolutely miserable. She would have taken my name and title and money and given me nothing in return. Whereas you, he reached across and took my hand. You gave me everything I never knew I wanted, a partner, a friend, a love I did not believe I deserved. I felt something tight and painful in my chest finally release. All this time, I had carried the weight of believing I had stolen something from him, robbed him of the life he should have had. But these letters proved what he had been trying to tell me for months. I had not stolen anything. I had saved him from a mistake that would have destroyed him. "We need to show these to Vivian," I said. "Are you certain?" Richard asked. "They will hurt her. They will force her to confront the person she was." "I know, but she needs to see them. She needs to understand that what happened was not just my fault or your fault or some cruel trick of fate. She made choices too. She played her part in creating this situation. And she needs to take responsibility for that before she can truly move forward." We called Vivian to the library that evening and presented her with the box. I watched her face as she read through the letters, saw the shame and horror and recognition cross her features. When she finished, she sat in silence for a long time, the letters clutched in her shaking hands. "I was a monster," she said finally. "I was selfish and shallow, and I treated you." She looked at Richard, "as though you were nothing more than a means to an end." I convinced myself that I deserved better, that I was too special to be tied to someone so serious and dull. But the truth is that I was the dull one. I was the one with nothing to offer beyond a pretty face and a practiced charm. And when I ran from that altar, I thought I was escaping a prison. But I was running from the best thing that could have happened to me. She turned to me then, tears streaming down her face. "And you, Eleanor, you saved him from me. You gave him the partnership and love that I was incapable of giving. I have been feeling sorry for myself, thinking of myself as the victim in all of this. But the truth is that everyone is better off because of what happened that day. You found each other. You built something real. And I got exactly what I deserved, a passionate love affair that burned bright and fast and left me with nothing but ash and regret." Richard spoke then, his voice gentle but firm. "You are not a monster, Vivian. You were young and confused about what you wanted. We all make mistakes. The question is what we do with those mistakes, how we grow from them." "I do not know how to grow from this," she whispered. "I do not know how to become the person my child deserves to have as a mother." "Then let us help you," I said. "Stay here, not forever, but long enough to have your baby safely, to recover your strength, to figure out what comes next. And let us show you what real partnership looks like, what real love looks like, so that someday you might find it for yourself." She looked between us with such hope and gratitude that I felt my heart break and heal all at once. "You would do that? After everything?" "We would," Richard said firmly. "Because Eleanor is right. We are stronger together than apart, and that includes you, as part of this family, for as long as you need us." The winter months passed, and slowly, carefully, we became something like a real family. Vivian helped with Catherine, learning how to care for a baby by caring for ours. She spent time with Mrs. Blackwood, learning household management, developing skills she had never been taught because she had been raised to be ornamental rather than useful. And she talked with me. Long conversations by the fire where we unpacked our childhood and our complicated relationship and all the ways we had failed each other. I learned that she had been just as lonely as I had been, just as uncertain of her place in the world, that her brightness and charm had been armor just as much as Richard's coldness had been, a way to hide the fact that she did not know who she was or what she wanted beyond the next moment of excitement or approval, that she had run from the wedding not just to escape duty, but because she was terrified of being found out, of having someone like Richard see through her performance to the emptiness beneath. And she learned about me, about the years I had spent invisible and overlooked, about the secret life I had lived in books and letters, about the courage it had taken to step into that wedding gown, and the months of exile that had followed. We had been twins, but we had never truly known each other, had never taken the time to see past the surface to the complicated, flawed human woman beneath. But now we did, and it changed everything. Vivian's child, a son, was born on a snowy February night. I was with her through the labor, holding her hand and coaching her through the pain as Richard had once held mine. And when the baby finally arrived, small and perfect and wailing with the indignation of new life, she looked at him with such fierce love and terror that I knew she would find her way. She would make mistakes, yes, but she would love this child with everything she had, and that love would teach her how to be more than she had been. We christened him Thomas, after our father, though Vivienne said she did not care if he ever acknowledged the boy. She did not need our parents' approval anymore. She had found something more valuable, a sense of her own worth and capability, a purpose beyond chasing excitement and approval. In the spring, when Thomas was strong enough to travel and Vivian had fully recovered, she made plans to leave. Not to return to London or to beg her way back into society, but to travel north to Scotland, where a widowed aunt had offered her and Thomas a home. It was not a grand life or an exciting one, but it was honest, and it was hers, and she was ready for it. The day she left, we stood in the drive saying our goodbyes, and she hugged me tightly. "Thank you," she whispered in my ear, "for everything, for forgiveness, for showing me what real strength looks like, for being the sister I needed even when I did not deserve it. Be happy," I told her. "Be the mother Thomas needs, and write to us. We want to know how you both are." She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and then she was climbing into the carriage with her son in her arms. We watched until they disappeared down the drive, and then Richard put his arm around me and pulled me close. "You did a good thing," he said, helping her find her way. "We did a good thing," I corrected. "All of us together." We walked back into Ashford Hall, into the home we had made, and I felt complete in a way I had never felt before. I had my husband, my daughter, my place in the world. I had been forced into this life by accident and circumstance, had stumbled into it wearing someone else's wedding gown and carrying someone else's dreams. But I had made it mine. I had transformed it from a prison into a sanctuary, from a duty into a joy. That evening after Catherine was asleep, Richard and I stood together in the library where so much of our relationship had unfolded. He pulled me into his arms and kissed me gently. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small velvet box. I should have done this properly long ago, but I was too stubborn and hurt to see what was right in front of me. He opened the box to reveal a ring, simple and beautiful, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. "It had belonged to my mother," he said. "She wanted me to give it to a woman I truly loved, not just to fulfill a contract or duty. I should have given it to you months ago, but I was waiting for the right moment. And then I realized There is no perfect moment. There is only now and us, and the choice to keep choosing each other every day. He took my hand and slid the ring onto my finger beside the plain gold band I had worn since our wedding day. Eleanor Hartley, will you marry me? Not legally. We have already done that. But in your heart, will you choose this life with me? Will you choose this love? I will, I said, and I was laughing and crying at the same time. I will choose you every day for the rest of my life. I will choose this love, this home, this family we have built from impossible beginnings. He kissed me then, and it was the kiss of a man who had finally come home, who had finally found the place he belonged. And I kissed him back with everything I had, all the love and gratitude and fierce joy that filled me whenever I looked at him. We had not had a traditional beginning. We had not followed the path that society expected or that we ourselves had planned. But we had found our way to each other through deception and truth, through anger and forgiveness, through duty and ultimately choice. And what we had built was stronger for having been tested, more precious for having been hard won. I became a duchess the moment the priest spoke the truth, and I lost everything the moment my husband heard it. But in losing everything I had known, I found everything I needed. I found a partner who saw me not as a replacement or a mistake, but as myself, wholly and completely. I found a love that grew from the ruins of other people's plans into something uniquely ours. I found a home in a cold northern house with a difficult, complicated man who loved me more than I had ever believed possible. And if I could go back to that morning when I put on my sister's wedding gown, if I could undo the choice that led me here, I would not do it. Not for anything in the world. Because this life, this love, this man, this family, they are mine. Not by accident or by deception or by anyone else's design, but by the 1,000 small choices I have made every day since that moment in the church when everything changed. I am Eleanor, Duchess of Ashford, mother to Catherine, wife to Richard, sister to Vivian, and most importantly at last myself, whole and happy and exactly where I belong. The years that followed brought all the ordinary joys and sorrows that make up a life. More children, 2 sons who inherited their father's dark eyes and serious temperament. Seasons turning on the moors, harsh winters and gentle springs, summers golden with possibility, and autumns rich with harvest. Catherine growing into a thoughtful young woman who loved books as much as her mother and had her father's gift for estate management. Letters from Vivian, increasingly confident and content, telling us about Thomas's progress and her own unexpected happiness in the quiet life she had built. And through it all, Richard and I grew old together. His hair turned silver at the temples. My face gained lines from laughter and sun and the simple passage of time. But the love between us only deepened, only grew richer and more certain. We had our disagreements and our difficult moments, as all couples do. But we had learned how to talk to each other, how to forgive and be forgiven, how to choose each other again and again, even when it was hard. On our 25th wedding anniversary, Richard took me back to the library where we had spent so many hours falling in love without quite realizing it. He had arranged for wine and candles, and he led me to my old chair by the window where I had sat reading so many afternoons while he worked at his desk. "Do you remember?" he asked, settling into his own chair across from me as he had done so many times before. "Do you remember how it was in the beginning?" "I remember everything," I said. "The coldness, the fear, the slow thawing. The moment I realized I loved you and the terrifying certainty that you might never love me back." He reached across the space between us and took my hand. As he had done that first time we had really talked, really seen each other. "I loved you from the letters," he said. "I loved you before I knew I loved you. And I will love you until there is no breath left in my body, and beyond that, if such things are possible. We are fortunate," I said softly, "to have found each other even in such an impossible way, to have built this life from such broken beginnings." "We are not fortunate," he corrected gently. Fortune is chance and luck and accident. What we have is not fortune. It is choice. Every day I choose you, Eleanor. Every day I choose this love. And that is not luck. That is the most deliberate thing I have ever done. And so we sat there in the library where our love had first taken root. Two people who had stumbled into each other's lives by accident and stayed by choice. The candles burned low, and the fire died to embers. But we remained, hands clasped across the space between us, hearts beating in rhythm, bound by something far stronger than the vows that had been accidentally spoken on that November morning so long ago. I became a duchess the moment the priest spoke the truth. But I became myself, truly and completely myself, the moment I stopped trying to be anyone else and simply embraced the life I had been given. And in that embracing, in that acceptance and transformation of fate into choice, I found everything I had ever wanted and some things I had not known I needed. This is my story. The story of the wrong sister who became the right wife. The story of a marriage that began in deception and grew into the truest thing I have ever known. The story of finding love in the last place I expected it and discovering that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the strangest packages. And if someday my daughter or my sons ask me if I regret what happened, if I wish things had been different, I will tell them the truth. I will tell them that I would not change a single moment, not the pain or the fear or the terrible uncertainty of those early days, because all of it, every difficult step, led me here. To this man, this home, this love, this life. And I would walk through fire to get here again. I am Eleanor, Duchess of Ashford, and I am, at last and always, exactly where I belong.